Hi, I'm Zoe.
And I'm Benina.
We're two academic workers living in so-called Canada who have felt disempowered by our own experiences of precarious conditions at universities. We're also longtime activists in movements against racial capitalism and settler colonialism. Faculty who are on temporary contracts are also known as adjunct, sessional, part-time lecturers. Whichever name gets used, we teach upwards of 50% of the courses at universities and colleges. Many of us are overworked, over-scrutinized, underpaid, and insecure.
In this podcast, we are talking precarity and its effects on scholars, students, and education itself. Precarity is financial, social, political, and psychological, often breeding isolation. In fact, our disposability unites us with the many people who labor under precarious conditions. Together, in conversation with workers, comrades, researchers, and others, we use care and humor to disrupt the silence, shame, and exploitation of our lived precarity. By talking precarity, we build solidarity. What you're about to hear is one version of something we decided to call Precarity Archives. It's a phrase Zoe and I came up with to capture all of the remnants and objects associated with unstable employment. The notebooks and papers you carry with you because you have no permanent office or desk. The pictures you take down and put in a box when your contract ends. A Precarity Archive documents your own personal history of trying to get by. Precarity is often something invisible, whether it's the absence of the nameplate on an office door or the time lost to the job hunt and commuting to multiple part-time gigs. We may contribute to the invisibility out of learned shame and about our lack of stable employment, and so we keep those details quiet. Because of that invisibility and silence, it felt important to make precarity tangible through objects, and by gathering people to talk about the items they might include as symbols of precarity and the stories behind them. On November 23, 2024, Talking Precarity brought together a group of workers from various sectors in Toronto to explore the connections across their precarious labor conditions. Participants were asked to share something that represents an aspect of their past or present labor experiences to become part of a temporary precarity archive. The group of us was guided through a discussion and documentation process by lens-based artist and scholar Zinnia Naqvi. This process included using the archival object as a launching pad for storytelling, audio recording, and photography. Acknowledging Julietta Singh's observation that no archive will restore you, the workshop played with the meaning of an archive. Participants brought with them coins, a shopping cart, a pair of painful shoes, tools of the trade, many notebooks and mementos, items that will not find their way into the official archive. The capital A archive is what institutions deem worthy of keeping and remembering. Many institutional archives, like museums and galleries, are full of stolen objects and tell stories of domination and colonization. We understand the lowercase a archive to be a personal stash, sometimes scraps and small treasures that can range from family photos and newspaper clippings to vestiges of theft of land and culture. As Zinnia Naqvi has shown, the small A archive can be a powerful space to explore how we are connected by stories of loss and exploitation, and also by stories of solidarity and resistance. In the installation, called The Professor's Desk, she created an archive that documents the story of Dr. Kinyip Chun, a physics professor who fought back against systemic racism at the University of Toronto. Dr. Chun's story and Zinnia's archive of it ensure that we continue to learn from and honor this painful history. You can read more about Dr. Chun's story and Zinnia's work in the show notes, as well as find a link to Julietta Singh's essay.
The personal archive and its memory work raised discussion among participants of whether the archive is necessarily a desirable space. Participants in the Precarity Archives workshop noted that bodies themselves can archive histories of abuse and trauma. Archives may end up as cliches or places to warehouse dissent or collections that teeter on hoarding. At the same time, participants expressed the power of telling their stories, often for the first time, and seeing themselves reflected in each other's experiences. Mundane objects became entry points for disrupting the isolation, silence, and shame that often come with precarity. During the workshop, Zinnia worked with Anana Rafa to photograph the shared objects. These images were used to create a poster that documents this archive of precarity. The poster was then launched at the 2025 May Works Festival of Working People and the Arts, and a link to the poster is available in the show notes. In this episode of Talking Precarity, we're excited to share with you the stories behind the Precarity Archive. While their objects were being photographed, we asked participants 3 questions. The responses to the first question are in the following order of speaking: Keem, Alexandra, Dinah, Susanna, Anana, Chunlei, Zara, W, V, and Shams. Question 1. What is the object you brought today, and what is the story behind it?
When I read the email about this session, I was riding the bus home from work at 2 a.m. And then, the prompt was bring an object, right? I decided to think of something right away rather than over-intellectualize it and present something that might be inauthentic, something where oh my gosh, he is so cultured or academic for bringing this cool thing. And I just chose whatever was in my pocket, which was a coin purse. And it included a bunch of coins, my tip money from the shift that night, as well as some guitar picks and I guess the rest of my pockets, which I didn't, show and tell. But it was candy, candy or random scrap paper or random pens or just odds and ends, which I realized were just things that help me feel better while as I'm navigating the system of having to work and hustle for tips or money and all that stuff. So I'm working recently I started working at a music venue and I work in coats. I could have a really good night and pull a lot of money in tips, but it's all in $1 coins, which is really fascinating. And because usually it's kind of an afterthought, kind of oh, I have some extra change, why not just throw it in the bucket? But it adds up, right? And then I'm handling this giant mountain. And then I guess when I started working here, I started realizing oh, I have to roll out all my money and then see what I have. Rolling up all my dimes and nickels and quarters and obviously loonies and toonies and stuff. I was listening to a hip hop song or I guess an album on the way home, right? And I thought about how in the visual language of hip hop or even just Western media culture in general, rolling around in a pile of bills or money, it shows excess or that you've made it, you're living an ostentatious life. And it's usually a crisp bills, right? It's the only time it's coined is maybe in Christmas Carol, the Disney version, where Ebenezer Scrooge is swimming in the golden coins. But if I relate to my situation, I am also rolling in a lot of coins, but they're not that sexy. Some of them are shiny, right? But some of them look like they were from before I was born. So it was just kind of funny thinking about that, where if you listen to a lot of that music, it's aspirational. But here I am hustling another $1.
So I brought in a pair of black shoes, black flats, because as one of the temp roles that I work in, part of the uniform is that we are required to wear all black. And the shoes signify the fact that at one point early on in my career, that was the only pair of black shoes I owned. And I had to kind of dig in my closet to try and find something that would be suitable in order to kind of match the professional look that the agency I was working with was looking for. And it was just recognizing the fact that the shoes were ultimately inadequate because the shift that I had been assigned required me to have to be on my feet all day. And the shoes just did not provide enough support for me to be standing these long shifts. And I kind of learned that the hard way during my first, I would say, week or so on the job. And then I also had to wear those same shoes to transport home. So then it was just recognizing the fact that the shoes were ultimately, I guess, I called them too flat because they just were not able to provide the support that I needed for that shift. And it just connects to the idea of my precarious work in the sense that they just were unstable, and it represents a lot of different things for me in terms of just always feeling like I have to do more and kind of be in a position where I have to try and justify my existence in a lot of these different places, in a lot of these different temporal roles that I was assigned.
So I brought a lanyard from the Junos in 2012, which was also used to get on the train that was full of musicians that took you to Ottawa for the Junos. I wanted to bring this as a representation of the carrot of precarity, like the carrot that we're chasing as musicians, which is like getting famous. And so lanyards are sort of important in that way because they often act as a substitute for actual payment. But we just get to wear them for the weekend and we get to act like VIP, and then nobody actually pays us any money.
So my object is a wristband with rhinestones that I wear at dance gigs. I work as a showgirl and a cabaret belly dancer. And the reason I picked this object specifically was because I really like how it reflected how much work goes into presentation as a dancer. And a lot of that is unpaid hours. It is like how much work goes into working as a showgirl behind the scenes, because the wristband with all the rhinestones on it is it gives the vibe of some sort of elegance, which is something that I use to hide actually some burns on the back of my hands, which I got from ironing my costumes before gigs and such. And that kind of contradiction was something that I wanted to highlight.
My object is a vessel for holding something called supari. It comes from the cultural landscape that I was born in, which is the Indian subcontinent, specifically Bangladesh. And my grandparents and my family members, people around me sort of, ingest this, I guess, nut. I think it's a nut called supari. And they ingest it with the betel leaf, and it's kind of used after wedding ceremonies or any sort of celebration, or in the sort of everyday. You kind of roll it up like a cigar and you eat it, or you kind of turn it into a triangle and you ingest it in that way. You can kind of look it up online if you just search pan. Yeah.
So I brought a 2024 wildlife calendar covered in hand-drawn question marks. So a calendar often a tool for planning, and certainty now mirrors the predictable of my labor experience. Its original purpose to organize time has been transformed into a representation of unanswered questions and instability.
I brought a few objects, actually. I brought a personal sketchbook and a paintbrush to represent my work in visual arts. And that included, in terms of archiving memories, pictures, pencil portraits of my family, as well as a self-portrait. I brought a Midori journal, an engraved pen with my name on it, and a red pen.
I have 3 objects that kind of go in conjunction. One is a notebook. The other 2 are staff badges. So the notebook consists of, I think, almost 20 plus TPL branches like across the city that I checked off the list because I was running around 2 falls ago in 2022 trying to look for a job. So every weekend when my mother would be home, I'd take the Metro Pass and literally run around town and try to see if I could do 6 or 5 branches in one day just to go on job application. This was before everything went digital, ironically. And the other 2 objects are actually my library badges from the very first time I got hired, which was back in 2019. It's just a staff badge that has the old logo on it. It's quite vintage. I think it's kind of a cool little relic that I like to have because they don't have these anymore. And then the new badge is actually like a lanyard with the new TPL logo, and it says, "Hi, how can I help you?" I 3D printed a little logo on it because we like customizing it. Some librarians will put stickers on theirs or like gifts that the kids give them. And I also have a headset because as the library has become, I think, better due to funding and everything like that over the years, it's also been more prominent to like a variety of harassment and stuff like that and incidents. Hence, we always have a headset on just in case if anything's happening in the branch that should pertain to the senior leadership at the branch at the time. So that's my object.
So I brought a notebook. I'm usually carrying a notebook around with me, whether I'm at home or doing work or like going throughout the city. I am a bit of a stationery nerd. I really like finding like nice notebooks, even if they're a little pricey. And it is kind of a luxury that I indulge myself in. But the sort of main reason I carry notebooks with me around is I am very frenetic in the way that I do work, and I'm always working on like a ton of projects at once. I do freelance work. I do work running workshops and things like that. I do freelance research. I do vendors markets. I make my own art. I also am a creative writer, so I've submitted to magazines. And so because of that, I feel the need to write down every single idea, every single task I need to do. Every single time I have to remember to send an invoice or apply for a job, I write it all down so that way I can keep it all in one place and then just cross off things and keep my notes in one place so that I know what to write when I'm writing a grant or when I'm writing research for someone. So yeah, that's my object. I have a couple of post-it notes in like that current one. One is invoices that I have to send out. So I have like the list of people that I have to send out and what work I have to bill them for. Because that's like the thing about freelance work is you do a lot of the work of tracking how much work you're doing and keeping a track, making sure that you get paid for what you've done. And then I have one sticky note that's just a month calendar, and I just cross out every day that I do at least 2 job applications a day. And then I have another sticky note that's just kind of notes from an article that I was reading that I have to translate into a literature review that I'm doing for someone else.
I got with me my shopping grocery cart type thing with my backpack in it, and that includes my journal and the winter jacket and a flagpole with the Palestinian flag and the Lebanese flag on it, my kufiya, my camera, my headphones. And it's basically all these objects that I need to have physically within reach in order to get any sense of security. Living on the outskirts of the city, whenever I get part-time work, it tends to be in the heart of the city. So I have to commute about at least an hour to get anywhere. And then after I'm done with, say, my part-time nanny hours, if I want to do anything else in the city, I just have to continue doing it because usually it doesn't make sense to commute an hour to get to my home and then commute another hour to get to wherever I want to go and then commute another hour from there to go back home. So I tend to spend a lot of hours, quote unquote, killing time in the city until like my next thing. And so having the cart with me allows me to not have to physically be carrying everything. I've also experienced a lot of fatigue and body aches, symptomatic of like long COVID, but also just the impact of the world on my body. So I can't really carry things as much as I used to. So that's why it's also helpful. And then when I go grocery shopping, then having to commute, I can't carry everything. So yeah, all in all, that's like why I picked this object.
Question 2. What does it mean for you to archive your object or have it be part of this archive?
It's kind of interesting thinking about it because if I brought just one coin, right, it feels almost like I'm stretching, I'm making up some kind of meaning. Me bringing a collection that I didn't specifically compile, or like I naturally possessed it, was a representation of my situation and also all the dynamics at play in terms of like money and capitalism. And for me, a big part of it was I got this job part-time after like a year of only working like small contract projects or not having much luck with leads. What was kind of validating, almost intoxicating about this was like this bag of coins is a representation of my worth. Like it's really messed up at is how I think of it. But that's the world like I live in, at least, or I would say we live in. But for me personally, that's how I'm existing, right? Because there is a correlation between the better I make someone's night, the funnier joke I make. If I remember their jacket or their bag, I realize people are more inclined. I also notice age dynamics and stuff. I did notice that middle millennials tip more, but maybe they feel like they find me endearing or cute, but I'm able to notice things like that. That makes me feel good, because work is not something that feels good usually for me, right? I've also really feel good doing work like all those like research projects I've worked on, or weird art things. Those are very like esoteric, almost like ivory tower intellectual, where it's stuff that like, oh, it's like an indulgence, right? So me realizing, I guess throughout this year, I've cultivated such a skill set that is like such a luxury skill set. It's not exactly like recession proof, and it's not, I guess, like crazy valued in society. You want to put food on the table first, right? Before you like add on an evaluator or someone to like archive your work. So I guess that's something I realized thinking about money and work.
It means a lot to be able to kind of talk about something that is not something I can typically talk about, I would say, in a space where I can feel like I'm heard. So it just meant a lot to be able to talk about something that's had meaning for me. Like originally, I didn't actually know what I would bring in for an object because of that when you think about precarious work, it just seems sometimes it's hard to kind of really have a clearer idea of what or how you can kind of connect to the idea of precarious work. So it just was very meaningful for me to be able to talk about, something that seems simple to somebody else, a pair of shoes. But to me, there's so much layers to that. There's so much meaning to that. And it's just great to be able to kind of share space with others and tell that story for the first time, I would say.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I've been hearing about this project for a long time as the partner of one of the people who's doing it, and it's been mostly about academic precarity. But then when this workshop was happening, Zoe was like, you should come as an arts worker. And I was like, I should come as an arts worker. I think we're like even further along the spectrum of non-payment. Like we mostly do not expect to get paid for our artistic labor. And actually in the definition, like when you apply for grants, in the definition, like the Ontario Arts Council definition of a professional working artist is somebody who seeks payment for their work, not somebody who actually gets paid for their work. And partly because it's a May Works project, it seemed like appropriate to have people talk about making art and not getting paid for it.
To have this object archived for me was to kind of show the contradiction between the glamour and privilege that's kind of attached to being able to work professionally as a dancer or an artist, while at the same time showing the kind of unseen effort that goes into it through the wear and tear on the object. Like I have lots of rhinestones on it, which always come off, and they come off of different costumes and stuff, and I'll save those and attach them. So if you look carefully, all the rhinestones are actually slightly different, even though they're supposed to present the same, but it's not something you would be able to see in like a dark restaurant or in a really bright stage, for instance. So that was something that I wanted to archive.
It kind of reminds me of my grandfather because he used to eat a lot of pan. And specifically why I want to archive the vessel that holds the supari is because I actually think that it's a really beautiful object graphically and aesthetically. On the top of the object, there's this drawing of a goddess, Indian goddess of sort. I can't read any of the inscriptions on it because I think it's all in Sanskrit or Hindi, which I speak Bengali, so I don't have access to that. Culturally, I understand a lot of relations to the Indian subcontinent. I want to archive it as a way to speak about where I came from and the ways of being from that place, and more specifically to hold on to the memory of my grandfather.
I collect all those calendars since 2020. So I have it every year. So it's part of my documents and also part of my archives and also part of my thing. I can look back when I want to take a look what happened before and after.
For me, I've always been a bit of a collector. Like I said, like the old staff badge is like a relic. I was going to keep it anyway, but I didn't think about it as lowercase a archive until honestly this workshop. I'm like, no, this is an archive. This tells a story. This was like my very first hurrah at the library. I left and then I came back, and then you see all that time that passed in between. Literally COVID happened. So for me, I think archiving kind of stems from the idea of personal collection that just leads into like storytelling a little bit. I feel like all of these things combined kind of tell a story over time. And yeah, I love collecting things anyway. I'm a bit of a hoarder, I guess you can call it, but I view it more like, no, I like keeping things. I like physical things, and I want to have a reminder. So if I have children one day and be like, oh, look, like this is 2019, and they'll be like, oh my God, it's such a different logo in comparison to now.
So for me, I've always been a sort of analog type of person. I like to write things down. I like not just like the tactile experience of it, but I like that it's something that isn't living on my computer, that also archives kind of the way that I'm moving through the world. If I go through my old notebooks, I see, for example, the way that I was writing my thesis, and then at the same time I was working on other projects and how one influenced the other. I like that sort of story that notebooks tell. But then also to have it be part of this archive is really important for me because, so I work mainly in arts and education. And right now those are sort of two fields that are rapidly losing funding and rapidly becoming more and more difficult to survive in. And I think there's that joke about the starving artist, or all those kind of ideas about if you go into academia or if you go into the arts, you should expect to feel precarious. But I feel like people don't actually really understand what it means to be precarious in the arts and the amount of time and effort it takes to not only just be someone who's doing multiple different jobs or applying while they're also working or making art while they're also working, but also it feels like another job to me to keep track of everything, to keep track of how much I'm spending on supplies, how much I'm spending on commuting, how much I'm spending on going to like classes and workshops so I can keep up my skills. But then at the same time, having to constantly keep track of how much work I'm doing, where I'm getting work, what I can turn, even like the smallest idea that I have. Well, on the GO train, I have to figure out how, if I can turn that into a grant or into a research project or into an article that I can sell. Like it's, having it part is just to document the amount of work that I do into getting a little bit of work that actually pays and helps me survive.
I think a lot about my friends in Gaza, particularly a specific friend. His name is Wa'il Halabi. He's also a journalist, as well as my friend. And he's from Rafah. And I remember the days leading up to when he had to leave his house and just how devastated he was to have to leave the house, and how constantly he described the pain of needing to pack your entire life into a suitcase. And he grabbed his mother's like handmade traditional thobes. She passed away in 2021, and all these different like things that he could, and then he grabbed them and he took them with him to Deir al-Balah. And then he was displaced from there and he couldn't take the things with him, so he lost them. And so it's like with every different layer of displacement, he loses more of his archive. And then he received reports that his house was completely destroyed, and then he saw videos of it, and he actually cried on the air when that happened. So I think a lot about like this sense that's like in my body all the time, that I need to have these things within reach. It doesn't just come from the air, it comes from a certain kind of inheritance of lack of stability, lack of security, knowledge that what you have isn't yours to keep most of the time. And so it comes from this place of like wanting to preserve, and that feeling or that desire to preserve is usually limited to the archive in the sense of like preserving the past. But it's like, what does it mean to be in a constant state of needing to preserve the present?
Question 3. What did it mean for you to hear other people's stories of precarity?
It was really interesting, like hearing other people's perspectives and being able to connect or reconsider things. But yeah, I didn't realize that like, me going through past notebooks or like bills or records from like someone I lost in my family, is also a part of like archival work, right? Or me carrying around this bag of coins and talking about it, that is also archival work. It's nice being able to like connect and reframe these type of things.
Yeah, there's actually quite a bit that I related to. I think one of the pieces that really stood out to me is the idea of, I think a few people had mentioned, sometimes just being a working artist and just also having to kind of merge yourself with different identities. So I also consider myself a writer, an artist, and then so I have the dual layers of working freelance, but also having to kind of find different types of work to kind of supplement my income, because of the fact that it's just writing in itself can sometimes be a very unstable, isolating career, especially if you're early in the career and not really at a place where you can say you're more established. So it was definitely something that I connected with. Like I just felt so much, there's so much absence, to the idea that we all kind of are just having to take on so much and experience so much, but there's an absence in the sense that we are not able to necessarily really talk freely about these things, and just being able to finally be in a place where I could kind of connect and hear those stories. I just felt some kind of a freedom with that, to be able to talk about that and just to connect with others, and just also hear about like the hope that I felt like that was still there, and then just the things that we sometimes feel we have to do in order to kind of really define ourselves and establish careers that we can really feel passionate about. And that was something that I resonated with.
People here who have worked in events, like as the people who have to be on their feet for 9 hours and like not get paid very well and like deal with not very nice people, and thinking about how one of the ways that we believe that we get paid as performers is that we are like made to believe that we are better than the other workers who are there. And so I was thinking about solidarity around precarity, meaning there not being those divisions, and it being that they are workers and I'm a worker and we have different jobs and we're all being exploited by the same system. So I thought that was a really interesting group of people to have in the room together.
Something that spoke to me during the presentation was just how so many people had this shared experience of expecting more loyalty from their work that they weren't given, for all of the effort, all of the time and resources spent on being good workers simply is thankless labor that, by virtue of its precarity, is something that's very easily replaceable to these institutions that we work for these companies and corporations. And when it hits you in the face in the personal experiences, whether that's through the contract non-renewals or firing, which is coded as layoffs, you just realize that these businesses don't respect you at all. And yeah, because for me personally, I got into dancing because I had been laid off of my work. And it's another kind of funny contradiction where I have this privilege to perform as an artist, but at the same time, that push for me as a dancer comes from the precariousness of my career in searching for reasonable work. I always am able to come back to dancing because it's on a project or gig basis that I can pick up work here and there. There's the convenience of that, but it's not necessarily where I thought I would be if you asked me a few years ago where I would be.
I think most people's stories were kind of about precarity in the workplace, and mine is a little bit more about the precarious nature of not having an archive, lost archives, or not having space to hold archives. So I find in some way we are all kind of talking about a sense of loss. And I think that, being an artist, I also kind of think about the precarious nature of a career in the arts. I started thinking about how maybe being an artist for me is an inching towards something rather than a concrete way of being something. So I used to, in art school, I thought that like doing it full time or having a studio or having a practice meant that I would always sort of produce work and I would be an artist in the long term in that way. But I now actually feel like maybe my life and my upbringing and my cultural surrounding doesn't really align with that anymore. Even though I have a day job where I teach children and youth photography skills, I try to find one day to do or dedicate to my art practice. And sometimes I don't even actually get to really even do that. And just the fact that I'm still trying to get there is still, for me, a process of being an artist. And I also think that pedagogy and teaching kind of brought me back to being a practicing artist as well, like in teaching other people and young people specifically. Like I see myself in them, and it brings me great joy to teach them what others have taught me, or teach them something differently that might align more with their life or their upbringing, or invite my own life into their lived experiences as well. And I predominantly teach people of color from low income, at-risk neighborhoods. And it's kind of the neighborhood I grew up in. And so there's a very specific kind of story that's like being told in that space. And for me to kind of interject and also talk about other spaces and all of these things, like in many ways, for me, the archive is like an unstable place of being. And in my perspective as an artist, or also as a person who's immigrated into this country and lost parts of their archive, I think it's all like sort of intertwined.
So from listening to other people's story or after seeing all those objects, it's all give me a similar image what happened before as my own personal experience. I see people bring a notebook. I also have my own notebook. I see people bring all the different stuffs. I couldn't name all of them, but it's all remind my own personal experience. And it's all resonate with my own personal experience. But I bring this one just because this is a very thing can represent all the feelings I feeling uncertain about the labor experience and unpredictable of that.
Speaking to my objects, they're representative of my writing and editing background. I think when I mentioned when we were doing the table talks, the self-portrait is made in pencil, but it's a visual representation of how I identify. So it's a visual representation of me as a woman with she and her pronouns, but also a person of color. And yet I chose the medium of pencil because it's devoid of color, and the fact that it's also erasable. So there's that kind of lack of permanency in the work that I do creatively. And also I wanted to pay special attention to the red pen that I brought, because editors actually use the red pen or the red pencil crayon to mark errors on copy. And so for me, that particular piece is really indicative of the way I've had to make cultural corrections for myself to fit in the space of writing, editing, publishing, because it's mainly a space that has been predominantly provided for, or at least taken up by white males with privilege. And so as a person of color, as a woman, a Canadian-born woman with a cultural heritage of like a Filipino-Japanese family, there's a lot of narratives that I have to negotiate in that space. So that's primarily why I brought those items. And also to speak to the difficulty in the fact that anything that has to do with creative arts somehow is sometimes often devalued as a legitimate form of income or in a career. So, I live by contract to contract, project by project. So that form of precarity is very real to me. And that's why I brought those things on hand today.
Yeah, I heard a lot of stories. Honestly, everyone's story from today really resonated with me. And I think that's kind of a scary thing, because we're all connected through shared pains of job loss. I mean, it's something to celebrate, but there's also some sadness, I think, undertones to that if you think about it. I heard stories about somebody, who was studying medical anthropology and then took a very different turn because they were laid off from this company that they worked at for years. And I think my story relates to a lot of people because I was also laid off twice, actually back to back, right before I went on this job spree of applying to all these branches. And then when I got that call back in 2023, being like, hey, here's a branch, less than 15 minutes from your house, you're hired, the job is yours if you want it. And I can't explain that because I think in a gig economy, as we like to call it, jobs have become like commodified objects in and of itself. To have a job and to maintain and retain it and to have not only just a job, but a job with like pensions and benefits and unions, all that. And I think for me personally, like right now in this stage of my life, for the past few years, since getting hired back in the library, I actually worked the part-time job at the library in the evenings while also working a full-time job. And it's not easy and it is stressful and I do often complain a lot. But the constant thing I get from my parents is that you should be lucky because you have not one job, but two jobs and two unionized jobs, two public sector jobs. Do you know like how many people are struggling in this country? And I think, I was aware of it, but I think like you hear of it in numbers, but you don't know the stories. And like being here today, like, I'm like, no, these are not just numbers. There's actually people behind these stories that, unfortunately things have happened to them. And it's almost always people in power and privilege that likes to keep us at the level that we are, because the minute we rise up or we get a promotion or something where we're at their level, it's almost viewed as a bit of a threat. So your lack of privilege is somebody else's throne that they get to essentially sit on.
Again, there's that recurrent theme of people who are in the arts just dealing with something that I struggle with a lot, which is the whole idea of like selling yourself, of having that perfect sort of, again, like with that archive article, having that perfect soundbite or that perfect article or research project or art piece that like can turn into the thing that gives you fame or the thing that gives you recognition. A lot of people here have talked about that, and it's something that I spend a lot of time thinking about because I'm not someone who likes to be like on social media. I'm very quiet about my own life, but I've kind of become very aware of the way that marginalized identities and marginalized stories become exploitative when they're turned into artwork. That is, I have to turn my story into an art piece or into an article or like into a story that can then be sold and then they can talk about my marginalization. That is something that I struggle with a lot. And then also just like people talking about the sort of like navigating precarity when there's so much going on in the world. Someone here talked about Gaza. Someone here was just talking generally about politics and kind of the marginalization. Some folks talked about like gender dynamics or race dynamics in the workplace. That's something I really struggle with a lot as well, because I am constantly aware of the fact that I'm a brown woman, and I'm constantly aware of the way in which people who look like me are already marginalized in these spaces, and then having to just keep on going because you don't have any other option, even though you don't know if the reason why you're not getting a certain job or you're not getting a certain opportunity or the reason why people are walking past you at a market is because of what you look like or what they think about you. And then also just like going and doing research or doing work for someone and then having to go online and see the news and see everything that's coming out of Sudan or Congo or Palestine and all these different places. And I come from a war-affected community too, so it brings up all these feelings that I have about Sri Lanka. And then with that, I don't get the chance to like sit down and think about that. I don't get the chance to like reflect on it. I just have to keep working because I don't have that option to sit down and think about it. I just have to keep going. And that's like, it's nice to know I'm not the only one who has that kind of thought.
Someone talked about desiring the archive because they want to know their ancestors' stories, but then at the same time, they don't want to know because it's too painful. And that part really just jumped out and snatched me because it resonates severely. It reminded me when I started reading The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine by Ilan Pape, and he was describing things that happened in the Nakba. And in one part, he talks about the Tantura massacre, and then he talks about an interview that happened with the survivor of that massacre 15 days after the massacre took place. And that, like, that report with this witness was transcribed into this book. And it sounded just like the things that I was translating into English from Arabic on lives from witnesses and from reporters. And that process, like, I just had a complete breakdown on the street because I was listening to it as an audiobook. And it's like, that part really resonated with me, because it's like, you want to have the knowledge, but the process of getting that knowledge is so painful, because it's like you're pressing on that wound that is never given the chance to clot. And so it's like always constantly bleeding.
We were buoyed by the generosity of Precarity Archives participants who enriched our understanding of how precarity is at once deeply personal and political. Together, these stories provide an entry point for thinking about the connections between precarious workers. That means noticing how our lives are shaped by settler colonialism and racial capitalism, as well as how we recognize ourselves in each other's stories. The participants in the Precarity Archives remind us that workers are joined not only by experiences of exploitation, but also by our creativity and solidarity. As one of the participants said in their interview, it is an honor for us to hold these archives. We look forward to the continued conversations that this small A archive might contribute to. Drop us a line to let us know what connections these stories spark for you, or even what would be in your Precarity archive.
We would like to thank all of the workers who made this episode possible. Zinnia Naqvi for facilitating the workshop and photographing the objects, Anana Rafa for photography assistance, Milena Zappa-Steinbach for recording and editing. And we would like to thank all of the workshop participants, Kim, Alexandra, Dinah, Susanna, Anana, Chunlei, Zara, W, V, and Shams. Finally, we would like to acknowledge support from Oberg York and the York Global and Community Engagement Collaborative Project Fund that made the workshop and poster possible.
That's all from us for now. Thanks for being part of the conversation. We welcome your comments and suggestions and stories, especially your own experiences of precarity and any actions and organizing you know about. Visit our website, talkingprecarity.ca, to get in touch. You can also find details about our guests in this episode in our show notes, as well as links to resources we mentioned. Please follow us on Instagram at Talking Precarity and on Twitter at Talk Precarity. Talking Precarity is produced by Zoe Newman and Vanina Steinbach, with logistical coordination by Shannon Jayansopoulou. The show is edited by Milena Zappa-Steinbach. Our logo was designed by Elana Fricker, and the music is by Diana Thorpe. Johnny Kavuras provided technical support. Talking Precarity is part of a larger project that includes the Precarity Collective, whose words and ideas inspire and sustain us. Until next time, solidarity.